Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode on the road to 2000. Unfortunately, this game is not a 90 rated game, as you can see from the title, or 90% accuracy game, as you can see from the title. But then it's still a good game because there's a brilliant move, so that's still a good thing. So without wasting any time, let's get into the game. When this game was playing as black, my opponent started with the English opening, playing pawn to c4. Then I played the king's pawn opening, pawn to e5. Then my opponent played pawn to e3. Then I played pawn to d4, looking for a pawn exchange, to d5, sorry, looking for a pawn exchange. Then my opponent ignored that, then played pawn to a3. Then I took the pawn, then my opponent took back with the bishop. Then I played knight to f6. Then my opponent played knight to c3, also developing. Then I developed my other knight to c6. Then my opponent played pawn to d3. Then I played bishop to c5. The best move was to play bishop to e7. But then my opponent played pawn to b4, attacking my bishop. Then I moved bishop back to b6, but the best move was to move bishop back to e7. Then my opponent played pawn to h3, and then I castled the king's side. Then my opponent played bishop to b2. Then I played bishop to f5. Then my opponent played knight to a4, attacking my bishop. But I ignored that, then played pawn to e4, looking for a pawn exchange. Then my opponent ignored and strengthened the pawn structure. Then I played knight to d5, which is a mistake. But also my opponent taking here, I don't see it as a bad move. I can just take it back with the queen. But then of course my opponent didn't take the knight. The best move here was to move knight to e7, because after the pawn moves here I can capture it. So that's why moving knight to e7 was the best move. But then I played knight to d5 to avoid that move. But avoiding that move was to move knight to e7. Then my opponent played knight to e2, preparing to castle the king side. Then I played pawn to e5. Then my opponent captured first before going for the pawn exchange. Then I captured back with my knight to b6. Then my opponent played bishop to a2 because it was under attack. The best square for my opponent's bishop was to move to b3. But then my opponent went to a2. Then I captured, which is the best move. Then my opponent played pawn to a4. The best move was to ignore the pawn entirely and play another piece. But then my opponent had to move the pawn. Even capturing my pawn was also a mistake. But then I captured back with my knight. It's kind of a free pawn, but it's not really a free pawn, because my opponent did this. Took the pawn on f7, which is the best move. Then I took back with my rook. Then my opponent took my knight, and then I took back with the rook. Then the queen took my rook. Hence I said kind of a free pawn. Then I played bishop to d7, preparing to attack the queen. Then my opponent moved the queen to c2, attacking my center pawn. But then I missed that, or I made a mistake. Instead of protecting the pawn, I played queen to f6. Then my opponent castled the king side and ignored to capture the pawn. Then I played queen to g2, trying to protect my pawn. But then my opponent played knight to g3. Then I played bishop to e6, which is the best move. I'm still losing the pawn, by the way, but this is a blunder, which my opponent didn't fall for the blunder or the mistake. Instead played knight to rook to d1. The best move was to capture with the queen, by the way. So my opponent played knight to d1. Then I played pawn to b3. The best move was to play bishop to d5, protecting my pawn, but then I ignored protecting my pawn and attacked the queen. Then the queen played to b1, but the best move for the queen is to capture the pawn. But then my opponent played queen to b1. Then I played queen to f6, because this is a miss, because I'm leaving my pawn vulnerable. Now my opponent can capture the pawn, which my opponent did with the knight. And then I played queen to g6, preparing to capture the pawn, because the pawn on g2 is pinned to the king. So I was trying to capture the pawn on h3 by the bishop. or with the bishop, but then my opponent moved the king to h1. I guess the best square maybe was to move the other side, but this is also a blunder. Or maybe move the knight back. This is the best move. But then my opponent moved king to h1. Then I played bishop to f2, pinning the knight to the queen. Then my opponent played knight to pawn to f3, protecting the knight, which is the best move. Then this is where I played the brilliant move, playing bishop to h3, capturing the pawn. Of course my opponent can capture, but the best move for my opponent is to ignore and maybe play playing rook to d2, protecting the checkmate. But then my opponent took my bishop. Then I played rook to f3. Now I'm threatening a checkmate. Now my opponent had to protect the pawn that's under attack by the rook, which is under attack. When my opponent made the mistake, and now it's just knight in one. But the best move here for my opponent was to play knight to f2. This opens up the diagonal for the queens and also protects the checkmate. So I had to make the decision: do I first take the queen or take the knight? But then the best move was to take the knight first, and then after, if my opponent takes the queen, then go for this exchange. Now we have an open game or an open end game. Now we have to play, but I still have an advantage because I have 2 more pawns and my opponent has 3 pawns and 5 pawns. So I'm still at an advantage and much higher of winning, even though I had doubled pawns, but I'm still at an advantage. So that's how the game would have played out if my opponent didn't miss that mate, or maybe my opponent just gave up. But then that's how the game played out. Let's move forward until the game. This is how the game played out. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you for watching again.